Hey, welcome back to another episode of Revealed Apologetics. I'm your host, Eli Ayala, and today I'd like to welcome a very special guest with me, Dr. John West. Just a little bit about him if you've never heard of him before. He's the author of the book Stockholm Syndrome Christianity, where he explores how many believers today may be more influenced by secular culture than they even realize. Now, those who are familiar with this channel, where we speak a lot about worldview and the importance of identifying presuppositions and things like this, this topic is actually immensely important and relevant to the sorts of things that we discuss. And so I'm very happy to have Dr. West here with me. A little bit more about his background. Dr. West is the vice president of the Discovery Institute out in Seattle, and he helped start their Center for Science and Culture. He's written or edited over a dozen books and directed several documentaries. He also used to chair the political science department at Seattle Pacific University and holds a PhD in government from Claremont Graduate University. And he can correct me if I have any old information or if there's any updated information that we really need to know. But I'm really excited to have him on the show to talk about some of these ideas in his book and some other issues that we'll be covering today, especially when it comes to how the church is responding or maybe not responding well enough to the cultural moment that we are currently living in. So, Dr. West, thank you so much for joining me. Before we jump in further into the content of our discussion, could you share a little bit more about your written?
Sure, Eli. Thank you for having me. I think write this book. I think as theologically orthodox Christians, we often tend to blame what's happening in the surrounding culture on the big bad atheists or agnostics, and or progressives or whatever you want to call them.
Sure.
And I certainly think that's true. I mean, there's lots, so I don't diminish that. But I increasingly, both when I was in Christian higher education, then now my work with Discovery Institute, which I deal with a lot of faith leaders, it really became evident to me that a lot of what's happening in our culture, sadly, is being enabled by our fellow Christians and people who may be personally sincere in believing that Jesus is their Savior, but in their overall worldview, they're really mimicking more the talking points of the surrounding secular culture. And that I sort of really thought that before we start, or it's not really before, we have to do both, but instead of just looking at what other people are doing in the culture, that we sort of need to get our own house in order and ask, how are we modeling that? Are we really modeling a biblical worldview, or are we simply aping what is happening around us? And because again, especially I think when you look at Christians who go into science, into the government, into the entertainment media, even into the pastorate, certainly into academia, you're getting voices that seem to be an echo, not an authentic sort of biblical voice. And if that doesn't change, how can we accept or how can we expect the rest of the culture to be better than we ourselves are?
Mm-hmm. Can you go into a little more detail unpacking that? You argue that secularism isn't the core issue. And that's interesting when you talk about the big bad atheist, right? That's we tend to think of atheism as being much louder than it actually is in terms of the numbers. But their influence is obviously a great influence in American culture today. But can you go into a little bit more detail in terms of how you think the church has responded to some of these issues and where you think the church is falling short? If you could add maybe some specific examples you have in mind. Introducing All Access, your premium gateway to deeper apologetic and theological insights. Through Q&A sessions, theological lectures, and exclusive bonus content, All Access takes your learning to the next level. Support the ministry of Apologia Studios while unlocking incredible resources like Ask Me Anything, which is an interactive live stream featuring Jeff Durbin. We have the Academy featuring theological lectures from leading experts and exclusive content from shows like Apologia Radio and Cultish. With more exciting content on the way, there's never been a better time to join. Visit apologiastudios.com and click join to get started today.
Yeah, no. So in a way, I want to be clear. Actually, I think secularism is a problem, but secularists themselves are not the only problem. It's that Christians are buying into it. And they're actually, because what I've seen, particularly from the 1990s on, there was a lot of emphasis on recruiting Christians. If we just had more Christians in government or more Christians in academia, more Christians in the entertainment industry, everything would be great. Well, we have lots of Christians in all those fields, but they're not really modeling historic Christian beliefs. And so, yeah, let's talk about some concrete examples. I have I have about 5 or 6 chapters in my book that look at various things. So one is the area of science. So, the Bible is pretty clear that God is creator, and that means a lot. That's a really foundational concept. But it's also true that particularly since the rise of Darwinian evolution and some other things in the 19th century, that idea that creation actually points to a creator and that we are objectively the creation of a loving creator who has goals for us that we ought to follow, that idea has been really undercut by secular culture. And so if you go into the sciences, your belief in God as a creator ends up getting downgraded. And so let's look at one particular example. Probably the most powerful scientist in America for more than a decade happened to be a personally devout evangelical Christian. His name is Francis Collins. Hmm. And I don't, I can't get into his heart, so I trust him when he says that, he sincerely believes Jesus is his savior. Sure. But let's look at what he actually did. Well, as head of the NIH, which is this big government entity, the National Institutes of Health, that gives billions of dollars, helps direct science research. Again, as being that head, he was probably the most powerful scientist in America for more than a decade. Well, what did he do? Well, he oversaw the spending of millions of dollars, or tax dollars, to create a nationwide tissue bank harvested from aborted baby body parts. So from aborted babies from about 8 weeks to 42 weeks. 42 weeks, that's infanticide. But this was done with our tax dollars, and it was overseen, ultimately approved, by a devout evangelical Christian, personally devout. The same Francis Collins also oversaw the spending of millions of more dollars to basically support doctors and hospitals that are doing sex-destructive surgeries on kids, cutting off breasts and other private body parts for kids and filling them with puberty blockers. And he declared himself publicly as an ally and advocate, that was his term, of the LGBTQIA+, I can't remember everything that they add, that, movement. And so my point is, you can adapt and recruit Christians into science until the cows come home. But if they're Christians like Francis Collins, you're going to not get anything different. And in fact, probably the saddest epitaph on his career, he's still alive, but he's no longer in government service. Probably the saddest sort of commentary on this was, I forget what secular publication it was something like Slate, but they wrote something about how they had been concerned when Francis Collins was appointed, that because he was this evangelical Christian, that they were worried about that. But they said the article said we shouldn't have worried because he did everything we wanted him to do. Sure. What a sad testimony. If I were Francis Collins, I would be cut to the heart by that sort of praise. So I think, that's an area of science. But then, let's talk about something even more basic. And I actually start my book on this, which is biblical authority. Christians, historically, whether it's been Protestant, Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, and then especially, I say over the last 100 years, evangelical Christians, have made very clear the standard Christian teaching is that the Bible is absolutely true and authoritative. Amen. Well, and in fact, many of the Christian colleges today were started in America in the late 19th century because the first group of Christian colleges like Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Columbia were, by the 19th century, had sort of fallen away. And so we have groups like Wheaton College, or the college where I was at, Seattle Pacific University. Basically over 100 Protestant evangelical Christian colleges started in the latter part of the 19th century to sort of uphold biblical authority when the rest of America's institutions were going away from that. And they did a lot of good work. But if you see over the past 10 years or so, it actually goes deeper than that. But you really see self-identified evangelical Christians basically bailing on biblical truth and biblical authority. And so some of these highlights are, say, Andy Stanley is a Baptist megachurch pastor who teaches thousands of other pastors. If you go to his site, he trains other pastors. But he wrote a book called Irresistible, where he basically says that the Old Testament is, well, he calls it the obsolete testament. And he's not just talking about Jesus fulfilling the ceremonial law, which Christians always know. No, he's talking about it's obsolete. Christians shouldn't be following it. He actually even says we should reorder our Bibles to move it to the back of the Bible. And he basically blames everything bad Christians have done on that they pay attention to the Old Testament. Yeah. This is from a leading self-identified evangelical. And in fact, if you looked at people who endorsed that book, there were people who should not have endorsed the book.
Yeah.
And then you have Mike Licona at Houston Christian University, who has now written 2 books, and he's championing something he's called flexible inerrancy. Well, it's nothing like inerrancy. It's nothing like even those who don't believe that the Bible is absolutely true, but actually think that most of it is. He gets to, here's one example. He says that, some of the Gospels say Jesus on the cross said, my God, why have you forsaken me? Which is actually really deep, because Jesus is quoting Psalm 22, which then if you read, you actually get a real prophetic understanding of what Jesus was doing and thinking on the cross. But Mike Licona says, well, in the Gospel of John, he doesn't have that saying. He has Jesus saying, I thirst. And rather than saying what Christians for 2,000 years have said is, well, Jesus said both. There's no contradiction.
Sure.
I mean, and in fact, John is supplementing and adding additional things that weren't in the other Gospels, although he does have a lot of things that were in the other Gospels too. And again, there's no contradiction. There's no problem to solve. Mike Licona says, well, no, I thirst was a paraphrase or a rewriting of my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, if you get 1,000 people in a room and ask them to say, write your own paraphrase of my God, why have you forsaken me? I can guarantee you not one of them, unless maybe they've read Mike Licona, not one of them on their own is going to come up with I thirst. I mean, these are different things. So if that's your view of biblical accuracy, that you can't be sure whether Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me? Or if it's been reinterpreted as I thirst. And he also goes on to say that the I am statements from John, that you can't know how far that departs from what Jesus actually said.
Sure.
And we're not talking about here, no one's claiming that the apostles had, or the gospel writers had, a verbatim, a tape recorder or something. But it's always been believed from the very beginning that this is a faithful exposition of what Jesus said. And there's a difference between a close paraphrase and just reinvention. But
Sure.
And then Mike Licona, here's where you actually really get where he's going, is he refers to the Gospels or says that they're like Hollywood movies that were inspired by true events. But the authors, for their various purposes, I guess somehow inspired by God, can change the details, change the situations, change the words that people say, invent entirely new things. I mean, that's the other thing. In the book of Matthew, it talks about how there were some saints resurrected at the same time Jesus was. That has always been accepted as historical. Well, Mike Licona says, well, no, that was invented. That was made up, as sort of what I think he called like theatrics or pyrotechnics, just as an apocalyptic sort of, it was a fake story. Now, he says they were intending to present it as a fake story, so they weren't lying. And he got so much pushback on that. Now he says, well, maybe it was historical, or maybe it's not. He's not willing to say that it's clearly historical. And so my point here, so why am I bringing this up to the larger issue, is that, well, where is Mike Licona getting this? I actually call his view Jesus Seminar Light. He doesn't like that, but I think it's actually accurate.
I'm sure he would not like that.
And if you actually people are listening who know the Jesus Seminar, with a bunch of liberal theologians who would get together and vote on whether a saying of Jesus in the Gospels is really said by him or not. And if it got a majority vote, well, then I guess Jesus said it. If it didn't get a majority vote, then, well, I guess he didn't say it. And so really that's what Mike Licona is doing. And I'd say that although he's dressing this up as new evangelical theology, and sadly, he's right when he says that there are a lot of evangelical biblical scholars who are going in the same direction. Where ultimately does this come from? They don't cite the early church fathers. They don't even cite, Christians during the Middle Ages, let alone the Reformation. I mean, this is not, where are they getting it from? Well, it's from the rise of theological liberalism and the higher criticism in the 19th century, and they're just giving it new gloss. And so, they're replacing a genuinely, historically Christian worldview with these ideas that were anti-supernaturalist ideas that basically said that the Bible couldn't be supernatural because the supernatural doesn't really exist. Right. And so you have to deconstruct it with, materialistically. And so then you're seeing that. So you see in science, in the denial of God as a creator, and also denial of certain things like human from the womb on. You're seeing it in biblical authority, just quickly, you're seeing it in areas of sexuality, where I think probably most of the people watching would understand that, whether it be the breakdown of heterosexual, monogamous, permanent marriage with the sort of divorce culture, and actually sex outside of marriage, or with same-sex so-called marriage, where lots of Christians now, including people who identify as evangelical. In fact, just a few days ago, there was a news story about Fuller Seminary. And Fuller Seminary is one of the big evangelical seminaries, although it hasn't, it's had trouble for a long time, but
Yeah.
their latest issue is same-sex marriage. And the story inaccurately was that they're upstanding and defending their historic biblical marriage. They're not repealing their statement on that. Well, I guess that's true. But the deeper story is, in fact, at the same time they said that they were adhering to a traditional view of marriage, they said, oh, but faithful Christians can disagree with us on that. And actually, they're allowing faculty members to disagree on that. And so they have their primary professor of the Old Testament, Christopher Hayes, just came out with a book last year with his late father, arguing that Christians need to adopt LGBTQIA+. And their argument there was, in fairness to them, they didn't actually say that the Bible taught that. They said, well, God changes his mind all the time, and so we should be willing to too.
Yeah. What's interesting is you brought up the issue of inerrancy before. For me, I do think it is an issue of authority, and I think it is very much related to the issue of epistemology. You said something about, casting aside a Christian worldview. Now, we've discussed a lot of this on this channel, that worldviews are typically comprised of a metaphysical view, an epistemological view, and an ethical view, and they often tie together. What do you think the implications are for epistemologically? What is it that people are forsaking specifically, which in turn is actually evidence of replacing the authority of the Bible with some other authority? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think this sort of is a theme throughout my book. I think it's a complicated question, but I think for me, one of the big streams coming out of the 19th century is what I would call the rise of scientific materialism, and that we are just blind matter in motion. And of course, if you go back to the early church, it's really interesting because some of the arguments of the early church fathers were against the materialists of their day, the Greco-Roman materialists like Lucretius or Epicurus.
Sure.
And then, but that was always sort of an out there view, because compare a rock to a human being. I mean, there's a vast difference, and so it's hard just for people to observe nature and human beings and just come to the conclusion that we're just blind matter in motion.
Sure.
But we have in our sinful selves, we have there's no end to our self delusions, and so our intellectual elites, and Darwin was only one part of it, but he was a key part. Darwin, Marx, Freud, Nietzsche, convinced the elites that in fact at the base we are just material creatures, and so
Sure.
that means God can't really exist. That means that ultimately even our morality and beliefs has to come back and be deconstructed into that.
But how did the church get to the point where they've come to accept so many non-Christian assumptions? Like it seems as though it seems like there must be a way to identify a spot. Like this is where it began to seep in. Well, we often speak about Christians began to adopt. Like why? Yeah. What is it? A philosophical issue? Is it just not trusting in the biblical data, so on and so forth? Where do you pinpoint the issue there, Dr. West?
Well, I think and this might get us into some disagreement, because although I greatly appreciate the insights of presuppositional apologetics, sure. I also
don't worry, Mr. Dr. West. I don't intend to debate you at this particular moment, but feel free to.
So I would say that it's when Christians began to be persuaded that reason or that I would say even creation or nature and what we can observe points against the truths of the Christian faith. And so you had, because what I would say that from the early church on, you had a general understanding of that reason, revelation, nature, and God's word should point in the same direction, and that they are holistically and go, even though we're sinful, God did say, his morals on our heart. We do reject that, but nonetheless, we have enough that in sort of Romans 1 points us out that there's enough to hold us accountable, and that Christians always held that the Bible and human reason and God's general revelation point in the same direction.
Right.
And I think what happened in the 19th century, and again, there were things that happened before, but where it came at a crisis point, where especially in the name of science, people said, well, the facts and reason and what you used to think of general revelation is pointing this way, and the Bible is pointing that way.
Mm-hmm.
And then many Christians hunkered down and said, well, if that's true, we're just sinful, and so we won't care about the reason or making those publicly accessible arguments. We'll hunker down on just saying that we believe the Bible in spite of all of that. But that, rather than saying, well, no, you're going off sinfully into the darkness in that, and in fact, reason and revelation still say the same thing, and that Darwin is actually wrong. Not just because he rejects the Bible, but he's deluded and darkened in his reason. He's making false arguments that don't stand up. And in fact, our reason properly understood, and the actual facts of nature properly understood actually does point in the same direction.
Right. I want to make a point there too, because I know this is a common, and this is not a discussion about presuppositionalism or anything along those lines, but there is a common misunderstanding that presuppositionalism kind of downgrades the utilization of reason. But I think you highlighted something very important. You said reason properly understood. From my perspective, I would say reason properly understood is understanding reason within a context of a Christian world and life view. That reason is not this kind of neutral tool. So I just don't want anyone to be confused. I think we should reason with unbelievers, and I do think that it's possible to have a touch point between them in terms of interacting with them, pointing to the evidence of creation, so on and so forth. But I think you're absolutely right. Scripture and nature are pointing to the same God, and I think that's something that we need to emphasize in our discussion with unbelievers and even believers who tend to stray from these kind of basic biblical principles. But yeah, if you wanted
I'm glad you pointed that. And I wasn't, in what I was actually saying, it wasn't so much, especially when I was talking about the 19th century, was really before the advent of presuppositionalism. I was talking more generally that many Christians ended up bailing on reason and nature and just hunkering down. And they didn't realize that if you don't try to keep those together,
right,
that's how you get marginalized in culture. That's how you're playing into the falsehood to the other side.
Right.
And actually, you're right. I mean, I know, he was in a way a presuppositionalist popularizer, but, in my own Christian walk, I have to say, intellectually, the two most influential people were C.S. Lewis and Francis Schaeffer. Mm. And they both show, I think, some different sides of this. And so sure. I think you're right that at least the great presuppositionalists understand that they're actually trying to find a way that these come together. But I'm just saying more generally among evangelical Christians, whereas in the 19th century you had a robust argument. If you looked at a lot of evangelical Christians there who were not ceding the reason to the secularist, and maybe they didn't do it in the right way, but they were. But then you had at least a lot of rank and file evangelicals say, "Well, we're going to be faithful." And I actually, I look up to that they're going to be faithful in spite of everything the world is saying. But I just think that you don't want to. I'm not willing to concede God's reason, to the atheist or the secularist because they're wrong. That's right. And I'm not willing to let them off the hook that easily.
Yeah. That's excellent. Now, when I think of culture and Christianity's attempt to catch up to the culture, especially in like Christian music, if you remember music in the 80s and the 90s, where Christian music tried so hard to copy the trends of secular music and things like this, why do you think Christians today are often more influenced by what's trending on social media or in Hollywood or anything like that, rather than just sticking with what the Bible seems to just teach so clearly? It seems like we're playing catch up a lot. What do you think is the source behind that? Do you think it's related to the sorts of things that we've already discussed, or maybe something different? What do you think?
Well, I think it is related. Two things that I talk about in my book that I think are very influential to different aspects of Christians. But one is simply who do we look up to? Where do we get our information from? And I have a whole chapter detailing various sources of information like social media and other cultural things. And when I know in my own personal life, when I've come across Christian friends and others who they or their kids end up going off the deep end and you wonder why, it doesn't take that long to recognize, well, what sources of information were they listening to in the past decade? And so if you are listening and getting your information about the world from whether it be
MTV in the 90s.
MTV and entertainment or the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Atlantic, what social media, Google, you name it, you're asking for trouble. And so and I talk about, many Christians think, well, I have my solid Christian beliefs, and so I could just imbibe all this bad stuff and it doesn't impact you. But here's a practical example I give. So a lot of Christians have really bailed on traditional belief of marriage between a man and a woman. And they may believe it sort of in their private heart, but they're not really willing to articulate it. Well, why is that? Well, if you're getting your information from the secular media on this, so say you have your biblical beliefs over here, but then you're being told ad nauseum, well, all the experts say that this is unrealistic, this is against our biology, this is this. Or I actually talked about one study about gay marriage that took place in the year that the Supreme Court ruling was ruled, where there actually was a pretty even split still, that a very significant number of people, almost majority, were still against gay marriage. But the media coverage was like 5-1 on the other side, that they would only cite experts who only promoted gay marriage. Well, if you're imbibing that, at the very least, you're going to begin to get a disconnect. So you're either going to modify your belief and concede if the information you're getting about the real world is telling you, well, this is what the Bible's teaching is utterly unrealistic, no one else believes it. You're going to be at the very least starting to not really believe it and not being willing to uphold it, and at worst you're just going to flip to the other side. And so I think people need to take an inventory of where are they getting their information about the world. Yes, I hope about their faith they're getting it from the Bible and solid teaching. But if then they're going out, and how do you get your information about what's happening in current events and what's happening in culture? If you're getting information from the same sources that are feeding secular culture, you're going to get the same result. And then among academics, it's even worse. And I'll tell you about something else.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about academics as well, but you're right. I think what you've just said, I think, encapsulates perfectly the reality that there is no neutrality. You're not getting information out there in some neutral vacuum out there. That's just these are the bare facts. Everything comes from a specific worldview. What a news outlet chooses to put forth as their main stories, things like this. These are very specifically chosen to project a kind of narrative, which both sides of the fence do that. But it's important for us to recognize that is being done. And I think Christians need to be sensitive to the fact that the information that they're getting needs to be filtered through a worldview. And as Christians, I think we're called to filter it through a biblical worldview. Now, speaking to academia, you've warned that many Christian universities are slowly becoming indistinguishable from secular ones. And I could attest to that, just talking to people and things like that. This is something that is a very important issue. What warning signs, if we can speak to kind of like parents who are about to send their kids to university and things like this, what warning signs should parents and students be watching for in terms of this kind of growing indistinguishable? I mean, you can't really tell them apart in many regards. So what should parents be telling their young people before they're going off to college?
Before going to that, can I just piggyback off something you said about the facts? Because
absolutely. Go ahead.
I think is exactly right. And in my book, I go in detail because people often don't think this. They think, oh, well, the media, maybe they give us false facts. But actually, a lot of what they give are true facts, but it's selective.
Yes.
And so you're exactly right. The agenda setting function and how it's framed and the narrative it's put in, people don't realize. So the biggest thing isn't that the media is lying to you about, well, that someone was murdered when they weren't. It's that for example, 150 years ago in many American newspapers, they covered as a news story the sermons that were given each week by major churches. That's not done anymore. Why? Because they don't think it's newsworthy. It's not because it's not actually newsworthy to 30 or 40% of Americans who at least occasionally attend church, even now. It's because the point of view of the journalists, and I go through the surveys, is overwhelmingly that the people who create the news media content, even today, that's shared on social media, do not attend church, do not believe in God, or certainly don't have a biblical worldview. And so it's out of their worldview that they are framing what's important. And this is true, in science. The scientists who deny that things were created by intelligent design, by God, and that you can see evidence of design, it's because they're not willing to look at that evidence. And C.S. Lewis said something very profound, which is nature gives answer to the questions we ask her. So if all you're asking is, well, what does this materialist thing do? You'll get right answers to that question. Right. But if you don't ask broader questions, that's how you get misled. So
yeah, I think that's a great point. I used to teach history, so I always told my students how history itself is selective as well. I'll give you extra credit if you could find the chapter in your U.S. history book on the history of the development of toilets in the United States. And they're like flipping through and like, well, we don't find it, Mr. I was like, well, of course, someone chose to not include that in the textbook. History is not neutral. Science is not neutral. We can talk about the facts, but of course, facts are going to be interpreted in light of a particular worldview perspective. And so that's a super helpful thing to keep in mind. So I appreciate you bringing that up. Now, back to my question after that, unless you wanted to share something else. You wanted to piggyback off of what I said there?
No, let's get to higher education.
Well, with respect to higher education, I was asking in terms of giving some advice to parents. What should parents be telling their young people before they go to college, given the fact that there is this problem, this difficulty with distinguishing between universities that are based on Christian convictions or where they're supposed to be based on Christian convictions, but they're kind of seeping in or allowing secular ideas to seep in. What should parents be telling their kids?
I think parents need to make sure that they are the ones raising their kids and not the rest of the culture.
Profound. That's so profound, right?
It is profound. I actually have a section of the book where I talk about this. Obviously, Christians say, yes, I'm raising my kids.
Sure.
But are you really? Who is really raising kids? Is it social media? Is it TikTok? Is it a public school you're sending it to? Are you relying on a 1 week, 1 hour a week youth group to raise your kids? I mean, youth group can be good, but it's who is really right? What time are you spending actually equipping them with a Christian worldview? And also, I'd say forewarned is forearmed. And so the most important thing with regard to prep to college is that by upper grade school, at least, I mean, you should start earlier, but by upper grade school and certainly middle school, you need to be helping your kids understand the key pressure points, whether it be on sexuality, whether it be on science, whether it be on that the Bible is true, and beginning to you can't just shield them from these things. You actually have to raise some of these questions and then show them how, yes, the Bible really is authoritative, and help them see through some of the lies. Help them develop what my late friend Philip Johnson, law professor, used to call a baloney detector. Help your kids see through the baloney. And if you can do that, and it's not that you have to, you don't have to be expert on everything, but at least the key pressure points you talk to them about and help them learn to recognize baloney when they see it, then when they go to college, they will be much more equipped to, if they're given a line, to see through it. But if you wait for it, you just give them a Sunday school, not to downgrade Sunday school, but what people call a Sunday school.
I miss Sunday school. I wish there was more Sunday school.
No, I wish it, but I mean, often it's just very simplistic and doesn't ever, deal with the objections and help people, think through them. You are like sending them into a hostile, turbulent river without any way to swim or to, survive. And so I'd say pre-preparing is really key. Now, I'd also say that once you're searching for a college, I know, and this, I taught for 12 years, had tenure at a self-identified evangelical Christian university that sadly I would not recommend anyone go to now. But the biggest danger of the Christian institutions is that I saw parents go into great amounts of debt, sending their kids to an institution that they thought, they were going to integrate their faith with and in fact, it was the exact opposite. And in fact, it's even worse. If you go like at the place that I was at, where it was even beginning to change, where the people who were teaching the theology and Bible classes that everyone had to take themselves thought the Bible was riddled with errors. We had a biology faculty at Seattle Pacific, even while I was there, who prided themselves on the fact that they didn't have anyone who ever joined the Evangelical Theological Society because they would have had to agree to inerrancy.
Wow.
They boasted about that to each other. I remember one of them particularly boasting about that, and who were arguing that the Bible's riddled with errors, and then other heterodox things like they were preaching open theism, that God Himself doesn't know the future, and I tried to help counter that as a lowly political scientist, with the students who I mentored, and giving them the other side on that. But my point is that you have to be, if you're going to send your kids to a Christian college, you have to do appropriate vetting, because it might even be better for your kids to go to a secular college if they're on guard than to send them to a Christian college, so-called Christian college, where people are saying, "Oh, I'm a devout Christian," but saying the exact same things.
Right.
I saw so many students have their faith harmed because from these self-identified Christian professors who were basically preaching the same sort of.
You put your guard down at a Christian a Christian school. You put your guard down in a way that perhaps you wouldn't do at a secular school. So
how can you find out? Well, so you don't need to read my book to do this. On my website for my book, StockholmSyndromeChristianity.com, I have a list of 10 questions you can ask, because Christian colleges are changing all the time. But what are some of the questions? Well, things like, if they have a chapel program, mandatory chapel program, which they should if they're a Christian school,
sure,
who are they inviting? This is something that now, post-COVID, most of these things are put online so you can actually see. If it's a never-ending sequence of woke invitees, that will tell you something. Are they inviting people who actually defend the historicity and authority of the Bible? Are they inviting people for the chapel to actually defend a biblical view of sexuality? Are they inviting people, on biblical archaeology, on pro-life issues, on these other pressure points that are really being, pushed on? And if they're not, that tells you something. And in fact,
Well, I just want to cut in because you made me think of something. So I did youth ministry for quite some time, and we took our kids to these big youth events. And I remember speaking at a breakout session where this gentleman was saying something that seemed to suggest that the Apostle Paul was in conflict with Jesus over a particular point. And I had spoken to the guy afterwards, and he told me that, they didn't agree, and that's what he learned in seminary. And I was like, really? That's very fascinating. And this is a conservative, retreat event. I don't remember the name of it, but that really stood out to me. And these things actually happen. This isn't kind of just being extreme and over exaggerating. These are real things that those who are in ministry, hopefully, I'm sure I'm not the only person that would attest to something along those lines. And that's rooted in the idea that the scripture is not a unified voice, right? It's not inspired in a way that where God is speaking in Christ Jesus in the gospel, He's not speaking in a consistent way in the writings of the Apostle Paul. And that's something that we need to recognize and reject. So I think that's an excellent point that you point out there.
Yeah, and so along those lines, one of the things people can ask of the faculty, and when they're getting recruited by the college, is, well, how many members of the Bible or theology department are members of the Evangelical Theological Society or something equivalent? Now, ETS isn't perfect, and they haven't always enforced lines, but if the reason they're not a member is because they reject inerrancy, that will bring it out.
Yep.
And so, and then other simple questions, there's usually a campus health center. Do they ever refer kids to Planned Parenthood? Do they prescribe birth control to non-married students? Do they, these are some questions that if you ask and you get the answers on, you'll get a fairly good barometer of what's happening at that school.
Yeah, those are excellent points. Dr. West, I think that it's so important that when we're raising our kids, that we are raising them in such a way that they are firmly established on the authority of God's word in a consistently biblical worldview. But that's easy to say. What does it look like for Christians to build their beliefs from the ground up on the authority of God's word? Maybe you can give us some practical examples.
Yeah, that's a big question, but I think, it starts with the Bible itself, but it also starts knowing the big themes of creation, fall, redemption, sort of restoration ultimately, and making sure that you yourself know it if you're a parent, and that also your kids know it. And then, there are curricular resources you can use. But I'd say when it comes to public, things today, there are these pressure points where where you need to maybe double down a little bit more because, so you need to give the big theme of the creation, fall, redemption, sort of restoration, glorification, but you also need to focus in on the places where the culture is most pushing back on those, because those are the wedge issues where Satan, if you will, is going to, can get in. And so I think also when you're talking about public culture, I think, ideas like God created us in his image and understanding what that means.
Sure.
And also that God's, morality is not relative across the situation. There is this natural moral law that God created for everyone, and that the Bible expounds that. But that also goes, but just because someone rejects the Bible doesn't mean they have the right to reject those biblical commands, because they're right for everyone. I mean, the prohibition on theft or stealing or murder or keeping promises, those things apply always and everywhere. And even if people reject them and don't recognize them, but you need your kids to understand that, because they're going to be confronting, especially various forms of relativism.
Sure.
When they go in, and they're going to also be getting various forms of rejection of God creating us in his image, male and female in his image.
Yeah.
And it comes in different ways. I want to say, most of my book, I guess, goes against what people might consider sort of streams of theological liberalism. But let's talk about God creating everyone in his image. Originally, human beings are, we're different. That no human being is equivalent to a dog or a cat, and neither is any human being equivalent to God. I mean, human beings are created in his image, sort of equally in an image. They can deface that image, no question, but there is an inherent dignity there. I'm seeing now on some segments of people who identify as Christian, particularly young males but who also identify as politically on the right, who are really pushing things that I would consider genuinely racist and genuinely anti-Semitic and some other things, and actually saying that not all human beings really are created in God's image. And so I think that it comes from the left, but there are various ways, a lot of different ways to go wrong.
Sure.
And so I think that those of us because I am fairly politically conservative, but I think that sometimes those theologically conservative Christians so completely identify with whatever is happening with, say, politically conservative people, whether they're secular or not, that they are getting trapped in a different way. Because I will say the degrading of blacks, for example, comes right out of the scientific racism of Darwin. And the secular alt-right that actually explicitly argues that different human strains are evolved differently and at different stages of evolution, and that the white racists are the top of it. And so that the Christians who are buying into some of that rhetoric are buying into a worldview that is very anti-Christian. And I think especially for conservative Christians, theologically and then politically conservative Christians, they need to teach genuine biblical equality, or else they're opening their kids up not just to leftism, but also to some really scary things that are on fringes of the right.
Yeah. That's excellent points. Just two quick things. So I want to highly recommend, I'm actually going to hopefully read your book soon, The Stockholm Christianity. But I also want to, before I kind of change the direction of the discussion here, is to suggest to folks who are sending their kids away to university or to college, I want to recommend the book Surviving Religion 101 by Michael Kruger. Which is an excellent book. It's written in the format of him writing letters to his daughter, answering her questions that she's confronting at the university. So that is Surviving Religion 101 by Dr. Michael Kruger. I think he's the head over there at Reformed Theological Seminary. Solid guy. And for those who like issues in biblical canonicity, you want to check out his book Canon Revisited as well, which is an excellent resource. Now, that being said, you did make mention of being theologically conservative. But then, of course, when we hear that language of conservative, we think also of politics. Can you help Christians navigate? How do we hold in balance our biblical and theological convictions and our political views? Some people tend to kind of meld them together and say, well, if you're this, then you have to be this politically. Can you help us navigate those difficult waters?
Yeah, I should be able to do better than I am, probably, because as a recovering political scientist, that was my discipline. Yeah.
Okay.
What I would say is that if Christianity is true, it applies to all of life, and so the idea that you can simply hunker down and be, privately devotional, and that there's no implications for the rest of the world is just false.
Right.
On the other hand, it is true that sometimes Christians try to give a level of the absolute truth of things that Christians can disagree on. And so I would agree, a lot of Christian thinkers in the past have talked about this, that the closer you get to, down to very specifics. I mean, actually, here it's interesting. Both Calvin on sort of the Reformed, Protestant side, and then Thomas Aquinas, both in different ways, talked about that when you go further down from the direct commands of God's laws and make what Aquinas talks about determinations or in very specific cases, that things get, it's harder to know what is at. You should be a little bit less doctrinaire.
Sure.
And this is why actually Calvin was very against the idea that, and I may be sticking in here too, but very against what, there are some Reformed Christians today going out of the theonomist stream that, well, all the laws of ancient Israel should be applied to today in America. Well, actually, Calvin disagreed with that because very strongly. Because
you're stirring up the hornet's nest. I'm connected with some pretty hardcore theonomists who might make a 2-hour response video.
Yeah. Anyway, but I'll say on my view is that, so I do think that it's a valid point that people need to be careful that just because the Bible gives clear guidance doesn't mean it gives exhaustive guidance on everything.
Sure.
So I would say things that get closer to, like, the Bible is very clear that human life is alive in the womb, and God intends that. And so I think life issues are pretty, clear. I think when it comes to sexuality, I think the Bible's really clear. So we're talking about public issues, the things that government causes. I think that, the closer you hew to what the Bible actually says, I think, the more that Christians ought to be willing to say, no, this is the right way. And then in other areas, let's take a hot button issue today of say immigration. I have come to some different views on immigration than I had 10 years ago, and I think people are rightly to be concerned about immigration. But I do think that I'm a little bit loath to say that there's one Christian view that you have to have on immigration, because it gets to the question of prudence, of how much the law should say this, how aggressive you should be. And, I think there are a lot of biblical principles.
Sure.
I mean, the Old Testament actually talks about that immigrants actually are expected to adopt a lot of things of the culture that they're coming to. And so I think, this idea that you just bring people in who may reject, some core teachings of your society, that's not really biblical. On the other hand, the Bible isn't going to tell you, how you should remove people, or what all the standards should be, or how, you welcome the immigrant yet have standards. I mean, I think there you make prudential judgments that Christians can disagree. And so I think Christians should be empowered to do that. I think if I were a pastor, I would be careful about trying to give, here are the 10 points that everyone needs to do to be a Christian on your view of immigration. And I think that I think really need to try to listen to each other. So I think, so I think determining what are the non-negotiable things, and not being willing to compromise on those, and what are the things where that there's sufficient differences of opinions. And partly it's difference of opinions based on differences of how you understand the facts and understand and realize that there are legitimate places where some Christians can disagree.
Yeah. What do you think the role of the desire to be academically and politically respectable, what role that plays in terms of why the church tends to hold to certain views regarding academics and politics? Do you think that the church feels pressured to be quote unquote accepted and that impacts the way they teach and say things?
Yeah. So I have a chapter about who do we aim to please,
Mm,
because in diagnosing this problem, and I think that is a real problem. That if you're, it's not just who we're listening to, it's also then who are we aiming to please. And let me tell you, from the standpoint of Christian academia, when I was in, for the 12 years that I was in academia, early on, I was from the late 90s to the mid late 2000s. The Early on, one of the proof text at Christian colleges was this book written by historian Mark Knoll, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. Now, on one hand, it was making a good point that Christians should aspire to great scholarship. And he was saying the scandal was that evangelicals don't really have a mind. I don't think that was actually fair, but nonetheless, so it's great that Christians want to be, who are scholars, to be excellent scholars. But here's the problem: who defines great?
mm,
And the way I saw it work out in my campus, and frankly, the way I've seen it work out in a lot of other Christian college campuses that I know about, where I have some connections, is that being a great scholar meant being approved by, having your book published by Harvard University Press, or being approved by the New York Times, or being written up by the Atlantic. And I'm sorry, if that's your standard, that's not great scholarship. You're really wanting to please the world. And so I do
sure.
think, especially I saw in Christian higher education, the aim to please people in secular power and secular scholars, no matter how bad their views are, that is well nigh overwhelming. And Christians have persuaded themselves, now I'm talking about Christian scholars in many cases, have persuaded themselves that the good housekeeping seal of approval is not that they are being orthodox or in sync with the great Christian tradition from the Bible through the early church on, but that they're beloved by people at Harvard, or that they're professors at a secular school, big research university in their near where they're located are approving of them.
Sure.
And that's selling you down the wrong way. And I also write about something that C.S. Lewis talked about the craving for the inner ring. And I think a lot of Christians in leadership, in government, in academia, in entertainment, in the news media, this is an overwhelming urge. And what is that? It's, well, you really want to be in the most in group where the power is, and you're willing to compromise in order to get there. I mean, how did Francis Collins get the head of the NIH? Well, he had to make a lot of compromises along the way
Mm,
to become acceptable. And so I think this urge to be in the most innermost group is also really powerful, especially among evangelicals who are part of the elites.
mm. Yeah, that's some really important stuff there. Thank you so much for that. I didn't intend to ask that kind of question, but at first, before I kind of included it in my list, and I thought that'd be an interesting question to ask you there. Now, this is my final question for you, and then we'll kind of wrap things up here. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you've enjoyed it as well. Some argue that questioning Christian doctrine is just part of healthy academic exploration. So if someone says, hey, I grew up in the church, I've always believed in biblical inerrancy, but there's nothing wrong with questioning things that I was taught. So where should we draw the line between honest inquiry, asking questions of our faith and so on, and a betrayal of core truths? How would someone navigate that fine line?
Well, I think pastorally, I'm not a pastor, but speaking relationally, I think if people have honest questions, no matter how deep the doubts,
Sure.
they should be treated with kindness, and we should try to answer those doubts. Now, the problem comes if you have self-identified or even more generally identified people who are Christian teachers and mentors who are trying to mentor and teach others who are going against the historic Christian faith.
Mm,
Because if anything, they will do damage to people who may not have doubts. They may accentuate doubts of other people, and so that's damaging. That's hurting real people. And so I think that if you have teachers and people who aspire to teach and mentor other Christians who are the ones expressing the doubts and pushing it. Privately, one still needs to be loving to them, but one can't really let that go. You need to sort of say, well, that you're wrong there, because this is not true. Now, at a personal level, if someone is just enmeshed in so much doubts, I will say, I mean, this is really tragic, but let me say this. If, for you, let's see, for your spouse who you love or your children who you love and you've developed a relationship with, it's certainly true that as you're getting to know someone before you marry them, and even maybe in the early years of your marriage,
Sure.
You're still building trust maybe because you don't, and so then you may question, say, if they do things that you don't understand and question in a way that, maybe not is always that helpful, and so that's understandable maybe, but say you've been married for 20 years and you've developed a good relationship and you're always asking your spouse to prove himself or herself. I think that's an indication that something is not healthy. Sure. And so if you're a Christian who's been a Christian for 20, 30 years and God has actually answered your questions and that you have a relationship with him, but you're always asking him to prove himself, to prove that this part of the Bible is true, prove this, and that you're not going to believe unless God reproves it over. I think there's something more deeply wrong there.
Sure.
And I just think I can't get into people's hearts, but I do think that is sometimes the case where people are so wedded to doubts, if you will, to questioning everything in a way they really never want to settle on a truth. And it becomes an excuse, and it's an indicator of a deeper issue. That the issue really isn't whether, there's this contradiction that bothers them. It's really that, or this seeming contradiction that bothers them. It's really that this more deeper issue that I think that they need to deal with God and in bowing before him. So I do think there is an unhealthy aspect to it. But I do think that, say if you're a parent and your kids are coming up with questions, don't shut them down of saying you want their honest questioning and you want to help them deal with it, and you don't want to be threatened by that. And especially kids who explore all sorts of areas, but even if they're their adult kids, I think you need to lovingly show them a truer direction. But if you're in an elder or a leader in the church and you see another leader basically teaching things that are not consonant with the Christian Orthodox tradition from the Bible on, then you may have to push back more aggressively, and maybe those people shouldn't be teaching in your church.
Yeah, thank you for that. If we were back to Christian education and worldview, if we were to reimagine, and I get questions like this all the time, especially in terms of curriculum. I want my children to learn from a biblical foundation, so on and so forth. What kind of curriculum would you suggest, so on and so forth? If we were to reimagine Christian higher education from the ground up, what would it need to look like in order to be both academically excellent and thoroughly biblical? Thinking in terms of being biblical and doing things with excellence, what does that look like for you from the ground up?
Well, I do think it means a really vigorous general education program. So, but focused on the right things. So, in a lot of colleges now, they're cutting back on general education. But traditionally, your first 2 years was more general education, and your second 2 years was more focused. And in a Christian higher education, that meant, you really do study the Bible. You study Christian apologetics. You study, Christian philosophy, and then you also then study in maybe a sequence on history, but from a Christian standpoint. And I think that a lot of colleges have gotten away from that. And so I think that you actually need to do that aggressively. But then you have to make sure that you don't just have the content in name. What are they actually teaching when it comes to the Bible? And I think it has to be a defense of the canonicity, a defense of why the Bible is true and how it's the basis of things, as well as the big concepts that we talked about: creation, fall, redemption, and a way restoration. But a key part of that Bible focus has to be whether it be presuppositionalist apologetics or worldview or evidentialist or some combination thereof, of really answering students' questions so that they understand not only what the Bible is teaching, but that it's true,
right,
and it's non-negotiable. Because a lot of that, a lot of the academic ease, even, well, we'll talk about our various, understandings of the background of this and that, and they don't get. And here's the fun things happening linguistically with this, but kids need to know the basics, which is that this is the canon, why it is, and it's true, and that has claims on you. And so I think that it can't just, if it's a Christian institution, it can't just be dry academics. It has to be, a living, truth, and you have to actually connect with the objections that the kids are going to have learned about. And then on the history side, sort of, I'd say, the history of the world, but particularly the history of what I guess we'd call Western civilization, but I think, it should be broader than that. That needs to be taught so that people really understand, because right now, most Christians, say if you're a Protestant evangelical, you don't even really know what the Reformation was about. You really don't know what the church suffered under the Roman Empire. You don't know. You don't know this stuff.
Wasn't the Reformation when the North and the South tried to rejoin together after the Civil War?
Yeah. And so I say reading, I am very appreciative of a classical Christian education. I don't think that that's the only way around it, but I would think in a collegiate Christian education, one of the great things would be what I would say, a modified version of Western Civ, which is Christian civilization, of learning the great Christian thinkers and great Orthodox Christian traditions, but also some of the heresies, so you understand what goes around comes around. A lot of things that, I would argue that when it comes to so-called theistic evolution, and I've written on this, and actually my book covers it to some degree, is really a reincarnation, if you will, of some of the disputes between the Gnostics and Orthodox Christians in the early church. Because the Gnostics thought, well, the world is bad and sinful, so God can't have directly created it, so he had to create a secondary entity that he wasn't, in some sense he was in control over, but really wasn't in control over, and that is really similar to how theistic evolutionists use evolution. It's sort of like the Gnostic demiurge. And so
interesting.
It's helpful to understand those debates, because then when you see it today, you understand this isn't something new under the sun, and it's not something that really was accepted previously because Christians actually thought through it. And so I think, that my dream, if you will, general education program would be a rigorous program on both the Bible side, but also apologetics, and also which many Christian schools have just dissed. Yeah. In fact, I know one sort of zeroed out the one professor they had of apologetics. But so, on the Bible, apologetics, and Christian philosophy and worldview, but then also a historical, Christian civilization where you actually get a better background in, great Christian thinkers. From the early church fathers, certainly beginning with the Bible, but then the early church fathers, the Middle Ages, the Reformation, to the great saints actually in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries who did stand firm and argue against many of the things that unfortunately now plague us.
Yeah. Just listening to what you're saying, I'm like, check. It makes me feel better. The fact I work at a classical Christian school, and where you just said that it's not the only way, and that I agree. We do tend to cover many of the things that you've discussed, and that's very encouraging to see kind of that match up there. But ladies and gentlemen, I've been speaking with Dr. John West, the author of Stockholm Syndrome Christianity. I'm looking forward to, let me ask you now, is there an audiobook version of the book?
I'm happy to announce there isn't one, but that an audio distributor just picked it up. So sometime in the next some months, there will be an audio version.
Excellent. Okay. But for now, people can pick it up on Kindle and the paperback or hardcover. I'm not sure if it's available in hardcover. And Dr. West, this has been an excellent discussion. I hope that my questions were relevant to your field of study, and I have very much appreciated what you had to say here. Is there anything that for those who maybe have not read your book or will not read your book, and you're saying, hey, maybe they're not going to pick up a book. What is one thing that you want my audience to take away from this discussion and just the core crystallization of the main point of your book? If you can give it to them here, if they're not going to read it, or maybe they'll read it somewhere down the line.
The one thing, and this may sound really minimalistic, but I talk about in the book about the concept of do no harm. And, maybe you're a Christian who feels overwhelmed. I can't solve all the problems of the world. And that's true. You're not called to do it. I actually talk about it in the book. But even if you don't think you can do great things, do no harm. What do I mean by that? Take an inventory. How are you currently using your time, talent, and treasure? Are you actually actively involved with the biblical church? Or are you going to a church that maybe once was biblical, isn't anymore, but you're still donating, you're still supporting, even though it's going off in the wrong direction? Well, you need to ask God to show you whether you need to go someplace else. I don't believe in willy-nilly leaving churches, to be clear. The last church my wife and I were at before our current church, we were 18 years. I was an elder there, and it took some really serious changes for us to go. Nonetheless, I know people who have stayed at churches that, say, went off the deep end rejecting biblical marriage, and they themselves didn't agree with it, but out of a misplaced sense of, our friends are here, they're willing to stay. And so I think you need to ask yourself, about the church, about where you're donating money. I know people who are writing checks to Christian colleges that they went to 30 years ago or 20 years ago when they were good colleges, and they themselves know that those colleges aren't anymore. But out of a misplaced feeling of devotion or warm feelings, they're writing a check. So even if you can't, say, donate to good places, how are you stewarding the resources you already have?
Yeah.
And that's, if every Christian would take seriously about, even if they feel overwhelmed about doing new things, of just how am I stewarding the resources I already have in my time, talent, and treasure in the church I'm involved in the charities I'm involved in or giving money to, I think that would be a good place to start. But of course, there are a lot of other things too.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much for that. Once again, I've been speaking with Dr. John West, author of Stockholm Syndrome Christianity. Pick it up if you're able to, and hopefully I'll have you again on in the future. This has been a really interesting conversation, and hopefully you'll be willing to come on in the future. We can talk about some other related issues. Well, that is it for this episode, guys. Until next time, take care and God bless. Bye-bye.